Good morning. Still have a few coming in. I suspect we will have a few more. Jonathan's class, I believe, some at least will be in here this morning since Jonathan's not here. I see Eric is here. Good to have him with us this morning. We'll go ahead and begin this morning with a prayer. Our Father in heaven, thank you so much for all of our blessings. Thank you for this beautiful morning that we have to gather together with each other here, to have fellowship with fellow Christians, and to study your word together this morning. We pray that as we study your word, that we may go to your word, and that we may learn from it, and that it may have an effect on our lives, that we may grow, and that we may learn more of your Son. Thank you so much for him, for his sacrifice for us. And it's in his name we pray. Amen. We continue our study on the book of Romans. We are still in Romans chapter 1 this week. We should be picking up with verse 23, which is really a continuation of the thought that is going on in 21 and 22. In verse 22, begin reading there to help continue the thought. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. So here we have an account of how mankind has rejected God as the creator, and we talked about this some last week. And whenever man rejects God as the ultimate authority, the ultimate power, the creator of all things, then it's natural that he will turn somewhere else for his source of power, for his source of origins. We all know that we came from somewhere. We all know that the world also must have come from somewhere. And if we say that it was not from God, then men turn to other places, just as these verses say, to look for where man came from, what is the ultimate source of power. And in verse 23, it says that they exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images. So looking back in history, we think about some of those images. We think about some of the history behind that, particularly in the scriptures. And we think of mythology and idolatry, which of course the two tie together strongly. Now, whenever we think of mythology today, we generally think of maybe interesting stories or movies. We think of movies like Clash of the Titans, or maybe books and series like Percy Jackson, and we think of these Roman mythology and Greek mythology as entertaining stories. But we must realize to the people of that time, these were not just entertaining stories. This is who they worshipped. And if we go back then in history, the same thing. Think about the kings of the book of Daniel. Well, we have Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar did a few things. As far as his gods, he set up a massive statue. So everybody worshiped this statue. He also considered himself to be a god. And we know that God humbled him. He made him interesting. Here it's talking about people worshiping the beasts of the field. What happened to Nebuchadnezzar whenever he believed himself to be the ultimate power, the ultimate authority, that he was a god. God humbled him as one of the beasts of the field, to where he was hairy and he ate grass and essentially lost reason. But we know that Nebuchadnezzar actually learned from that. He turned around, he repented of that. But do we remember his son? Who was Nebuchadnezzar's son? You remember the story of how his son also was a king, and he had considered it himself so great. And he said, everybody, look at all the things I've done. Look at what appeared on the wall behind him. A hand that wrote on the wall that your kingdom is going to be taken from you immediately, and you are going to die. The ultimate thing that happened because of his being so proud, him calling himself a god, was destruction, not something good that came out of it. So we see by looking at the kings of Daniel that yes, they worship idols, but they also worship man. It does seem to be often where it ends up, doesn't it? And then we look at the gods of Egypt. Gods of Egypt in many ways were like the gods of King Nebuchadnezzar that he had, or the gods of so many before them. And they worshiped the sun and the moon, and they worshiped animals. Whenever we look at so much of their art, what do we see? The gods being men in the likeness of crocodiles and jackals and beetles and hippopotamus, and we see all the things that they worshipped around them because they rejected the God that they were presented. So where did that lead them to turn? And then ultimately, what did they start doing in their later years? They turned their leaders into gods as well. So not just these mythological gods and these animal gods, but they did the same with their leaders and turned men into gods. And then we can go on and we can look at what Israel did. By the way, it is interesting to note in looking at the 10 plagues, what did the 10 plagues of Egypt represent? Each of those plagues addresses the gods of Egypt and shows God's power over every single one of their gods. It's a very interesting study whenever you look at those plagues, how they tie to the gods of Egypt and God defeating their gods. And yet the Israelites, having escaped from Egypt, they're not all that long into their wandering, and Moses is up on a mountain, and they think he's dead. He's gone. He's not coming back. So what do they turn to for their God? Gods of the nations around them. They build something that so many times people worship. They build a golden calf. And even turn aside their high priest, Aaron, who has communicated with God. He knows the God of Israel. And yet, he says, well, maybe I'm afraid they'll kill me, or the people, they have to have their way. So I'm going to go ahead and allow them to have their way and build this golden calf. And then whenever Moses calls him out on it, what does he say? Oh, it was the people, and you know what? Anyway, this golden calf just kind of sprung up on its own. Really? Does he think that Moses is buying that? And yet, we do the same thing as we will talk about as far as culturally and worldwide, and maybe even sometimes in our own personal idols, though not like these idols. And then we'll move on to the gods of the Romans, because this is the book to the Romans. I think it's appropriate that we talk about their gods. So in their mythology, where did their gods come from? So essentially, their origins in some ways have concepts, as so many do, in that of creation. There was nothing, and then there was this primordial force. I guess that was their ultimate god at the time. That primordial force that we would call chaos, essentially, created their primordial gods. And one of those primordial gods was Cronus, the god of time, if you would have it. And Cronus and one of their other gods had children. I believe it was Rhea. And Cronus didn't like those children, so he ate them. But they fought back, and Zeus defeated Cronus. Of course, Zeus, by the Roman name, would be who? Jupiter. And so Jupiter defeated him. He had his other brothers, and then what did Jupiter do? He ate his kids, right? And they broke free as well. And the gods of the Romans had very human traits. They were sexually immoral. They were violent and full of hatred, and so many of the traits. I mean, they even had a god by the name of Bacchus, who was the god of every kind of sick sort of partying that you could think of. We know him generally as their god of wine and drunkenness, and all the things that leads to. So there's the Roman gods in context here that Paul is writing about, where he says in verse 23 that they had their gods resembling mortal man and birds and animals, and then ultimately creeping things. How many people in here like spiders? I'm not a fan of spiders. Riley's not afraid of spiders. Riley came up the other day carrying a spider, has it in a bowl. I'm like, can I look at that? She's carrying a brown recluse around, right? Not afraid of spiders. I'm certainly not touching a brown recluse. I'm not even touching one of those little long-legged spiders, that can't hurt you. I don't do that. How many of us would worship these things? Worship worms and spiders and centipedes and all the insects that we would call creeping things. Not even intelligent insects for the most part. And yet they turn their worship to those things. That shows just how sick in the mind so many became whenever they turned their focus away from a God and began worshiping the world around them. In verse 22, there's a few things that I would like to focus as far as these forms of worship. One of those would be humanism. Humanism is whenever we turn our focus to man and say that man is the highest pinnacle of, we'll use what I was talking about last week, of evolution. We have come from this primordial soup. Sounds kind of like the Romans, doesn't it? And then come up through this first living thing, a single-celled organism that is spread, and we can go all the way up, and then the innate racism in humanism and in Darwinian evolution, and that some men are more evolved than other men. Some men are more intelligent and cultured and just higher evolved than other men. How racist. And yet, that is where Darwinian evolution and where humanism leads us, saying that man is the highest pinnacle of things. And we say, well, we don't do those things. And yet many in the religious world and many in the churches turn to a different form of humanism. Humanism is alive and well in churches today. What does humanism mean in a church? Feel-good worship. Worship that is the way that I want worship to be. Essentially, I am looking for a church to go worship at that does worship my way. Y'all remember the commercials from back in the 80s, maybe even before, of Burger King? I've always liked a Whopper. I haven't been to a Burger King in years. Maybe Burger King's not quite what I remember as a child, but the whole thing with Burger King was have it your way, right? We will do it your way. And so many other fast food adopted their model from what Burger King had brought. And that's great for a fast food chain to do it people's way. But the church isn't a fast food chain. And worship that feels good to me, worship that centers around to me, isn't worship for God. It's humanism. Also, you see on the slide here that I mentioned Hollywood Church. That kind of ties into the same thought. Well, what does Hollywood Church mean? Well, whenever we put our focus on the entertainment, again, what makes me feel good, what keeps me awake, what, it makes it to where, I'm having enough to keep my focus in church. And I'm not saying that our worship can't be interesting, but if our focus becomes on the entertainment, literally to where we have a three-winged circus in our churches, and we have people coming down of holes in the ceiling and on wires zipping through the church, and entire rock bands. Is this the worship that we see laid out in the New Testament pattern? Where in the first century church did we ever see anything like that? Oh, it was there. We see it. It was in pagan worship. It was in the worship of the Romans and the Greeks and the Corinthians and all around them. Worship where they would literally worship with sexual immorality because it was worship that made them feel good. The worship of self-gratification. Today we see signs. Attend the church of your choice. We're also going to apply that to read the Bible of your choice, serve the God of your choice, and all these statements. What's the key focus of this sentence structure? I'm not an English major, but it looks to me like you, or if we're turning that back on ourselves, me. It's me worship. This is what Paul is addressing here. And then, if we look back just a minute, when I was talking about Moses, how Moses dealt with the problem of what Aaron had done. Moses is gone. Aaron was afraid of the people. He let the culture at the time influence him, even though he should have been the religious leader. Instead, he had fear and capitulation to the culture around him, to the people. And he said, the people want a golden calf? I'll give them a golden calf. Do we ever do that in our churches and our worship today? Do we say, oh, all the other churches around us are worshiping this way, so this must be the way that we should worship? Or that the people around us who they're Christian people, and they are living in a certain way, whether it's a form of immorality or a form that is turning them away from a focus on God. Do we say that, oh, we're going to do that too? It's a form of Stockholm Christianity. There's actually an interesting book on that out. How we become captive to our culture, and then once we're captive to that culture, we start agreeing with the way that culture behaves. We start empathizing and sympathizing with our captor, and ourselves turn to behaving the same way. And then also, these kind of thoughts, this kind of behavior that turns away from God and turns to the things of the world, turns to a devaluing of obedience. Remember, whenever we started the book of Romans, in verse 1, Paul says that he is what? Paul, a slave to God. Paul, a slave to Christ. A slave indicates entire obedience. He had his entire obedience to Christ and to God. But in our culture, we don't generally see obedience as something to be proud of, do we? It's generally not a trait that we uphold in our culture, as is reflected in our culture. We do not generally see obedience being a strong trait in schools today. And look at the problems that comes about because of that. We don't see obedience in the workplace, at least as far as obedience is in just doing my job, showing up to work, and how dare my boss ask me to actually do something. We don't see those as strong traits. In fact, for many years in our country, we have idolized the rebel. Probably all even familiar with the saying, rebel without a cause. And we even have symbols in our culture. And I understand some of the cultural richness to this, but whenever we take some of those symbols that are associated with rebellion and say, I am proud of this symbol of rebellion, even if you don't associate racism with certain symbols, some of those symbols definitely mean I'm a rebel. But Christians, rebels, maybe rebels against sin, that's fair enough. But not rebels against God, our master. How many of us in our culture are proud to say, I have a master? Yes, also a father, and we are children to him because he loves us. And that is the righteousness that he imputes to us that we're talking about in the book of Romans, the other part of the strong focus of the book of Romans. But we should not devalue obedience. And that is why so many times in the church we see people saying, we are saved by faith alone. And that means you can live any way you want. Well, we'll see if Romans says that's the case. Some of the 7 characteristics that tie into this as far as God making, because if you don't have God, well, I guess you make your own God, as we've seen by so much that we've said so far. Number 1, not honoring God as God. That ties into much of what I have just said. Rebelling, not even looking to honor in any way that there is a creator, so we turn man into a God. Not giving him thanks. We look to men to be thankful for. In fact, we have a holiday in this country, a good holiday, Thanksgiving, which is a holiday in which we should turn our focus to thanks to God. And yet, so many today are turning that holiday instead into giving thanks to what? I don't even know. Being thankful to men for the things that they have done. Well, I mean, credit where credit is due, but the ultimate credit turns back to God. And then people become ineffective in their reasonings. Well, whenever you assume that there is no God, then you're going to have to come to some conclusion as to where you came from. Where then did I come from? Nothing? Well, nothing comes from nothing, right? Even the evolutionist doesn't believe that they came from nothing. Well, the Big Bang, where did the Big Bang come from? I could go into a lot of the accounts, the scientific reasoning behind these. They all require a great deal of faith. And so, in order for that to become the case, they become ineffective in the reasonings. And whenever you become ineffective in your reasoning, whenever you're not thinking straight, what happens? Your heart becomes darkened. Whenever you're not thinking straight, then you eventually turn to dark thoughts. And if your heart is darkened, then you turn to all of these things of the world around. You turn to whether it's actual worship of idols, actual worship of the beasts around you. And we say, well, nobody in America would do that. Really? There are actually people trying to pass laws in this country that would give rights to nature. Now, I'm not just talking about animal rights, and I believe that we should treat animals well, and I believe that we should be good stewards of the world around us. But that doesn't mean that I believe that the actual water and land around me, like the Indians believe, has spirit themselves, and that they are the gods that I worship. And yet there are people, even today, that do this. And that is not even necessarily just in our culture. There are certainly very large world religions that believe things like this as well. And it leads to the darkening of hearts. And then it says they become fools. What is a fool? Well, it reminds me of a quote from Dwight Schrute. Anybody know who Dwight Schrute is from The Office? Well, whenever I go to do something, and I'm probably not getting the quote exactly right, I ask myself, would a fool, would a stupid person do this? And if they would, then I don't do that thing, right? That sounds like pretty good advice to me. We don't want to be fools, people who do things that are not wise. And yet that's what happens to people ultimately as they travel down these characteristics of God-making. And being fools, they glorify man, because that's what a fool does. A fool assumes that a mortal man who is going to die is his God. But I assure you, throughout all of history, all of those men have died, save one, because he is God. All those men that you worship ultimately will let you down. So glorifying man instead of God will not be successful in the end, and it's a trait of someone whose heart is darkened and has become a fool. And even more so, those who turn past glorifying man and even move to something that doesn't have higher reasoning and glorify animals. And yes, there are people in our world who do even that. And once that happens, verse 24, God gave them up in the lust of their hearts to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves. What does this mean, he gave them up? Many read more into this than is there, some read less than is there. It means sundered, yielded up, entrusted, transmitted, gave over to. It means that he allowed them to have their way. Whenever we sometimes think of a rebellious child, we might go back, as we talked some last week, of the story of the prodigal son. And the son, he goes to his father and he says that, give me my inheritance. I'm going to go and spend it the way that I want to spend it. I want to go out and have fun. Here we have a rebellious child who is not wise in his ways. And we can picture how this father, loving this son, certainly tried to persuade him otherwise, tried to turn him back from his self-destructive ways, and yet the child was going to have his way no matter what the father says. So the father lets him go on. Does that mean that the father didn't still love him, as we talked about last week? Didn't still want him to come back to him? And yet, he still allowed him to go his way into these poor choices of the world. That's what it's talking about, how the Father, whenever we turn from him, and we continue to turn from him, will eventually let us go into our ways and our darkened thoughts. And look at the effect that that has on us. Look at a few verses on this. Psalms 81, verse 11. But my people did not listen to my voice. Israel would not submit to me, so I gave them over to their stubborn hearts to follow their own counsels. Israel, the chosen nation of God, the people that he loved. In fact, where Jesus said he would have drawn them to him like a mother bird with the chicks under his wings. And what did Israel always do? You see, time after time after time, they turn away to their own way. When we go to the New Testament church, and how long is it after the day of Pentecost where Paul has to start writing some of the letters that he has to write? And when we look at the book of Revelation, it's not even that long. And what is John saying to the churches? He's saying to this church, you've got this going on, this going on, this going on. Now, you do have a few good things, maybe some more so than others. But he says, you're at risk of your candlestick being removed. The same thing. The church doing the same thing as the people of Israel. Do we have that problem in the church today? Absolutely. There are churches turning to their own ways, turning, as in verse 24 here, to the lust of their hearts and impurity, not just degenerate in their worship, but degenerate as the church in Corinth, doing things that even the people around are like, oh, we're not even Christians and we don't do those kind of things. And yet here you are with somebody in the church doing that. Not only that, you're bragging on it. We see churches today with religious leadership living in sexual immorality and saying, oh, this is common today. This is just the way that people behave. Sexual immorality in all forms. In fact, some churches even dedicating their entire nature and center around, we celebrate that this is who we are. We are proud of this sexual immorality. Churches doing that, as Paul is addressing, as he will continue past verse 24. Also, let us look at John chapter 3, verse 19. And this is the judgment. Well, the light has come into the world, and people love the darkness rather than the light because their works were evil. Have you ever been in the darkness for a pretty good while? Maybe in a dark office or in a cave? Been in a cave that's so dark, whenever you go in that cave, they turn the lights out. You can't see anything because without light, you cannot see. If you're in the darkness long enough, you become used to the darkness. If we're in behavior of the world long enough, do we become used to the behavior of the world around us? Once you become used to something and accustomed to something, you eventually approve the darkness around you. It's on that darkness, I have, every time I come out of the darkness into the bright sunlight, I sneeze. It's actually a genetic trait that a small percentage of the population has, where the light has that effect. Somebody's been in the darkness long enough, their eyes, their soul, it atrophies. And the light not only becomes hard for them to see, it becomes offensive to them. We've done that in our culture. How dare you tell me how to live? It's not that I'm telling you how to live. I'm saying that this is what God says as to how we are to live. How dare he tell me that? I don't even believe in a God, and I rejected God who would try and tell me that I should live a certain way. He should love me enough that I can live any way that I want. That's what the darkness does. It not only rejects the light, it hates the light because it hurts. And yet it's the light that brings salvation from the darkness. Just like a rebellious child who rejects all counsel from his parents, nothing good will come of that for that child. And they traded the truth for a lie. We all like the truth, don't we? Maybe not always. Does the truth hurt? It does, sometimes. and not whenever the truth is on my side. Then it's great, right? A truth that I can present that feels good to me, that's good. But a truth that steps on my toes, well, that can be painful. 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 3 and 4. You ask and do not receive, because you ask wrongly to spend it on your passions. Meaning, I'm praying for what feels good for me. You adulterous people, do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Therefore, whoever wishes to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. We see so much today that says that, oh, you can't speak in absolutes. In fact, many years ago, I was at a ball game, and there were a couple of college students in front of me, and no, I didn't say anything to them, but they were having a conversation on this, and they said, oh, there are no absolutes. It's just whatever you think. And I really would have liked to ask them, and I didn't because I didn't know them, but I should have. Are you absolutely certain about that? Well, their very statement shows that they believe there must be absolutes. And yet, so many do that with the Bible and with the church. And they say that, oh, the Bible changes with culture. It's only culturally appropriate to today. It doesn't mean the same thing now that it meant then. And they exchange the truth for a lie. James chapter 4. Or we actually already read James there. I guess I read the wrong one first. 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 3. For the time is coming when the people will not endure sound doctrine, sound teaching, but having itching ears, they will accumulate for themselves teachers to suit their own passions, and will turn away from listening to the truth and wander off in the myths. Going back to the myths we were talking about earlier, whenever you reject the truth, you're going to have to come up with your own truth. And your own truth, in fact, we see that. We see that today, where people talk about, I will live my truth. What even is your truth? A perception of what you believe is true? That means nothing. That's not even a truth at all. If there is not absolute truth, then everything ultimately is meaningless except for whatever you perceive, which is no kind of truth whatsoever. Matthew chapter 6, verse 19 through 21. Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroys and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where, note this last part, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Where is our treasure? In the movies Pirates of the Caribbean, Jack Sparrow has this compass. It's analogous to his moral compass, if you would have it. And this compass is supposed to point him to the thing that means most to him. And sometimes he becomes somewhat confused, and that compass doesn't even know where to point him. Where is our compass? What treasure is our magic compass pointing us to? Is that treasure that we seek? Treasure laid up for us in heaven? Is it that we serve the Master? Is our treasure our pleasure in this world, seeking after whatever works for man? Maybe whoever is the greatest idol right now, whether that is the greatest, richest businessman, or the person who has the most, or the best singer, or the best entertainer, or the greatest movie star. Is that where our treasure is? Or maybe the greatest job, or whatever brings me the most pleasure in this life? Is that where our treasure is laid up? Or is our treasure laid up in heaven? John 14, verse 6, Jesus said, I am the way. He is the compass that points us to the treasure of heaven. And the truth. What is truth? Jesus is truth. and the light, because only through that compass, only through that truth can we have life. No one comes to the Father except through me. There are many seeking a way to a Father, a way to a God, but their way to a God, their way to that Father is a way of their own making, not the way that the Word teaches us. What are their ways? Their ways are materialism. We live in a world of material, that it is just a bunch of protons, electrons, neutrons, atoms, all of these interacting in such a way that it constructs everything that you see around us. There is no explanation for any cause except that which is naturalistic. And so that being the case, all that matters is, by the way, naturalism and materialism tie together, is materialism. Accumulate as much as I can in this life. Store up all the grain I can in my silos because tomorrow I die, right? If I have everything I can to eat and everything I can to entertain me and I've got the best car, that's materialism. Humanism, of course, all of these tie together. Humanism, as we talked about quite a bit today, that man is the ultimate authority, he's the ultimate power, he's the ultimate worth. And that we are the highest that man has ever been, we're the greatest that man has ever been. And the generations after us will even be greater. I don't know that that's true, but that's humanism. Idealism, that's kind of an interesting one. And that everything around me is only what I perceive it to be. I think, therefore I am, and the world around me is only here because I perceive it. And if I didn't perceive it, well, does a tree make a sound when it falls in the wilderness if there's no one there to hear it? According to idealism, no. That essentially everything around me is a figment of my imagination, so I am God. There's so many different thoughts on this in the world of philosophy, in the world of man, that we have turned our minds to because we turned away from God. Looking back on our study this morning, looking back on these, and as we will continue next week, we see how when man turns away from God, all the things that is left for them to turn to. And we see that in our world, and we see that in our churches, and we see that the effect that has had. And then we see what the solution is that Paul is presenting. We see who our hope is. Our hope is in God. Our hope is in Christ. Let's close this morning with prayer. Our Father in heaven, thank you once again for our blessings. Thank you for the great opportunity that we have to gather together, to worship you, to praise you, to worship you on your terms and not on ours. And may, as we study your word this morning, as we worship you, we seek to know you better and to make you the ultimate focus, and to lay up our treasures in heaven, and our treasures in Jesus and in the salvation that he offers. And it's in his name we pray. Amen.